Okay, welcome back. It's our lecture. It says chapter 22 here. This is actually going to be on chapter 21, reaching out, cross-cultural interactions, and looking at how long-distance trade and travel change the world. This chapter is very important for our study of world history. So let's get going. So the first thing you need to know is this relates back to a past unit, which is on the Silk Road. And the Silk Road, almost lost my textbook. The Silk Road was not just one road, it was a series of roads that traversed Eurasia, going east and west. And across this trade network were ships and caravans, both very, very important to trade across this region. And caravans were especially important across the Saharan Desert in North Africa. And we'll talk about them a little bit more. But as this trade's occurring across this region, you see the establishment of magnificent new cities across Eurasia, including Beijing, Malaka, Samarkand, Hormuz, Kaffa, where we would see the bubonic plague kind of first really take its wrath out on Europe. Alexandria, Constantinople, Venice, Timbuktu, all of them are still major, well, most of them are still major cities today that still exist along the Silk Road. So trade led to the establishment of what you see here, emporia, which are essentially trade cities. And you would see these cities would be very cosmopolitan. You'd see people of all different cultures, religions, um, political persuasions kind of coming together in these emporia to exchange goods. So definitely merchants lived well in these types of cities. Um, but unfortunately, a lot of this trade was kind of disrupted for a short period of time by nomadic invasions, especially the Mongols from north of China. But the Mongols would actually bring greater prosperity when they conquered pretty much all of Eurasia, bringing it under one rule, bringing it under one government, and essentially establishing peace, or Pax Mongolica. I will say that a lot, Pax Mongolica, peace, Mongolian peace. So trade flourished as a result of the Mongol empires. And if you look in your text, it doesn't have a page number on it, but after 503, so I guess that'll be 504 and 505, but it's not numbered, you will see just how vast the Mongol Empire was. And being under kind of a centralized rule and the protection of the military helped trade to flourish across this region. So another important city would be Malacca. And if you look at this map, which says the Strait of Malacca, there is also a city. If you look at your map where you see Malaysia, on the tip of Malaysia, there's a city called Malacca. It's still there today. Just think about, why would this city be strategically important to this region? And you think. You see that it connects multiple oceans and bodies of water. It connected China to India, and then India to Africa. So it's kind of like the go-between, especially between India and China. Vastly important. A lot of cities that flourished during this time weren't necessarily because they were near river valleys. That's not quite as important anymore because we have new irrigation methods. But now these cities are important because of where they are amongst trade routes. And Malacca is probably one of the greatest of all in terms of trading cities in this region. So the next person we're going to look at is Marco Polo. There's a lot about this guy's life written about it. Some of it is kind of called into dispute about whether it's authentic, but nevertheless, it is important. He allegedly traveled to China with his father, who was a merchant. Marco Polo was an Italian. He was a Venetian, who were, as you kind of saw from your unit on the Crusades, became vastly wealthy. Venice because of this trade they would establish between them and the Muslim world. So they would essentially bring goods from the Muslim world, which, things like spices and luxury goods, which the Europeans coveted, back to Europe. So the Venetians, an Italian city-state, became vastly wealthy because of this trade that occurred. But he went with his father to China to kind of establish a overland route there. So when he got to China, he was actually forced to serve under Kublai Khan, who was the essentially Mongol ruler of China in the Yuan dynasty. And he would essentially be kind of his advisor in terms of between the West and the East in China. Now he returned to Venice after being gone for 17 years. He was actually held prisoner for a period of time during a war, and by the commercial rival Genoa, which is where Christopher Columbus is from. He wouldn't come around for another 150 years. And when he was in prison, there was a guy there who chronicled his life and his kind of what he encountered in the East in China. So his stories would eventually make it to a lot of the rest of Europe. And when Europe got to read about, the types of textiles and luxury goods, spices that came from China, it kind of drove up interest in traveling to China. So whether or not everything he said was true, and if you look it up on the internet, you'll see a lot of it is kind of called into question by historians. There is no dispute that a lot of this did help kind of drive interest in establishing relationships with the East and going out and trading. So it kind of spurred an interest in exploration, which is what our project is all about. Again, we're at 1324. Exploration doesn't really kick off until the 15th century. So again, here's a picture of Marco Polo, the guy in the red, speaking with the great Khan, Kublai Khan. So obviously he's in a Chinese style of dress, addressing the Khan himself. So travel and trade from the 12th to 14th century. This is the Silk Road. I put that in air quotes, which you can't see. But the Silk Road is a series of trade routes. It is not just one trade route. There's overland, as you see across Eurasia, across the Arabian Peninsula, even into Europe. There's sea routes across South China Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean. And then there's this trans-Saharan route, which you see in North Africa. Very difficult. So it's a series of trade networks, not just one. So there was also political and diplomatic travel as well as commercial travel. So as people were trading across this region, they also had to establish diplomatic relationships with these places in order to establish trade relationships. You have to be friendly with the people you trade with. Otherwise, you're not going to trade. So Mongols on the east and Christians in the west in Europe and Muslims were kind of in between them. And to the Christians and Mongols, the Muslims were the common enemy. So they sought out a kind of truce between them in order to defeat the Muslim empires kind of around Turkey and the Middle East as we know it today. So Pope Innocent IV, he's a Roman pope in the city of Rome and in Italy, he invited Mongols to convert to Christianity. Hey, if you want to fight the Muslims, you better join us as Christians. But the Mongols, being the ever so great warriors they are, counter-offered and said, how about you just come under our rule instead? And that kind of put a halt to this diplomacy between the two empires. So they did offer some other forms of diplomacy. The Mongols did send and dispatch an Nestorian Christian priest who was Turkish. His name was Rabban Salma. In the hopes, here's Pope Innocent IV, basically telling his Christian monks to go to the Mongols and say, hey, join us. Love his hat. Anyways, carrying on. It's the tiara, papal tiara. Look at that. Anyways, Rabban Salma was a Nestorian Christian priest, and he was sent by the Pope to the Mongols in Persia. So the Persian Mongols were not Muslims yet in 1287. And this Nestorian Christian priest, Rabban Salma, brought the message, hey, let's attack the Muslims in the Middle East, and attack together in Jerusalem. However, the Europeans refused this offer because and it just didn't succeed in attracting European support for the Ilkhan in Persia. And in fact, only 8 years later, unfortunately for the Mongols and their enemy, the Mongol king there would convert to Islam. Oops, sorry. So the Mongols were kind of falling apart at this time. So the Ilkhan, the Mongol Khanate in Persia, was now Muslim. So that was problematic to them. They were their enemies, and now their Mongol brother has converted to Islam, and that whole region was now Islamic. So that kind of fell apart. Well, at the same time, there was a Muslim traveler by the name of Ibn Battuta. He lived from 1304 to 1369. He was well traveled, and Islamic influence was also well traveled in this region as well. Well, he was what was known as a Qadi, an advisor to the Sultan of Delhi. And basically, as a Qadi, he was basically kind of like a legal head. He had legal credentials and basically would go out and make sure that Islamic law was being practiced appropriately across the Muslim world. So he traveled across the Muslim world far and wide. He would actually go into cities and deliver lashes to people who were drinking alcohol, which is against Islamic principles and beliefs. Make sure that people's hands were amputated for theft. He in the Maldives, in the Maldive Islands, women did not cover their breasts. They were Muslim, but they refused to adopt to a lot of Islamic cultural and social norms, and that kind of irritated him. And Ibn Battuta was oftentimes irritated by a lot of things he saw in the African Muslim world because they didn't practice a lot of the traditions and practices that were practiced in the Middle East. So, but in his travels, he chronicled a lot of things that he encountered across the Muslim world, which is quite interesting. So here are his travels. He traveled far and wide, and red are his earlier travels, green a little bit later. So he did travel pretty much across the expanse of Africa and Arabia, and even some overland travels as well, but all in the Muslim world. And he was the advisor to the Sultan of Delhi, which is in India. So he traveled quite a bit across the world, so he probably encountered quite a bit as well. So we're going to stop there. In our next section, we will talk about some of the missionary campaigns for Islam and the spread of Islam. So along these trade routes, and we've talked about this constantly, you are going to see a lot of religion coming along with it. And merchants were mainly the ones responsible for the kind of delivering of religion in this period of history. Thanks for listening. We'll have another one tomorrow. You guys have a good one.